All right, listeners, guess who has two thumbs and is not mentioned in the Jeffrey Epstein files? Cousins, we're not there. We're good. Us and Dick Cheney, not in the Epstein files. How's it going, cousin?
Wow, that's a random reference to throw in there, like Dick Cheney. Well, he was too busy like invading countries, you know. So that's his
Exactly.
excuse. What's your
I can't.
excuse? Oh, I know. We're just not successful enough, apparently, because everyone who was successful, this was apparently the thing to do.
I can't remember who did this on X, so I apologize. But somebody posted a picture of Dick Cheney and said, "So he really just did it all for love of the game. There was really no other incentive besides
That's
that."
right. He's like, is he like Bill Belichick of geopolitics? They kind of look the same. They're grumpy. They were singularly focused on, I guess, executing. Oh no, but Dick Cheney never had that like kind of post-success career. He was just always all scowl.
Yeah, I mean, what would the equivalent be of winning the geopolitical Super Bowl? Certainly not anything that Dick Cheney approved. Anyway, we have a ton to check in on, cousin. We've got a 6-pack of content. We'll see how much we get through. I did, though, just want to start off. This wasn't on our list immediately, but you probably saw President Trump is trumpeting a new trade deal with India as of this moment. It's Monday, February 2nd, around noon Central. We're posting this probably tomorrow. Tariffs on India are going to go down to 18%. At least, the tariffs from the United States on India going down 25% to 18%. India is lowering its tariffs against the United States to zero, and President Trump says they're committing to buying $500 billion worth of U.S. energy, technology, agriculture, et cetera, and also that they're not going to buy oil from Russia anymore, instead sourcing it from Venezuela. India is one of the only countries that can actually refine that Venezuelan crude. So it's not a nothing there. I actually thought it was an interesting signal in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war. As for the trade deal, it really smacks of the EU announced a real free trade deal with with India last week, and President Trump doesn't want to be outshone, so he wants to claim that this deal is there. It's really not as big a deal as the EU deal. Anything you want to say about about the U.S.-India trade deal or these shenanigans, Marco, before we dive in?
No, but it was the big one, right? It's not a free trade deal, as you point out. That's true. But when you think about all the trade deals that have been concluded, there are really two outstanding ones. One was India. There was some rancor over South Korea, of course, which is a small country but a huge trade partner with the U.S. And then finally, we're still waiting for a final or a more sort of long-lasting China-U.S. trade detente. We have a truce right now, but that's the U.S. administration can now focus on that one. So this was a big deal, at least from their sort of April 2nd Liberation Day slew of trade deals. This was the big leftover.
Yeah, maybe from a PR perspective, but in terms of like long-term relations with India, I mean, really doesn't mean anything. Ironically, and I think India knows this, if you want to increase manufacturing competitiveness within your own country, compete with the rest of the world. Don't raise up a bunch of protectionist tariffs and then allocate lots of money in your government budget to make sure that these Indian firms can spend on infrastructure and capex and lead manufacturing-led growth. So, I mean, there's a lot of irony in there. And I think the EU-India trade deal long-term is a much bigger deal than what President Trump is floating here. But I did think if you're trying to put pressure on Russia and Vladimir Putin, taking India off the table in terms of oil imports from Russia, like that's not a small thing. So if India follows through on that, if you're now sending that Venezuelan crude to India, you are isolating Vladimir Putin just a little bit more. I thought that was worth talking about.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that angle.
All right, let's dive into our 6-pack. We are going to start with Iran. Which, if you listen to the Last Cousins podcast, you know how excited I am to discuss this topic. Going into the weekend, cousin, I didn't even tell you this. I had an Iran security expert on my podcast on Friday, and he scared the shit out of me. He made me feel like war was not only inevitable but imminent. And you should go check out the episode. The analyst is Hamid Reza Azizi. He's got a great Substack. But his point was basically, look, if they're willing to kill however many thousands of protesters they've killed to restore order to the streets, what do you think they're willing to do if they get into a fight with the United States? You really think they're just going to tuck tail and run? Like, they're going to go at it. They're going to go after Hormuz and everything else. And they've been sitting on their capacities because they know they did bad in 2025 against Israel. The gloves would be off this time. And I was like, oh my God. Um, the weekend has brought us, I think, some off ramps and also some anomalies. So the off ramps is that Iran and the U.S. are supposed to hold nuclear talks on this coming Friday. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is going to go meet the Iranian foreign minister in Istanbul. Apparently, among the attendees of the conference are Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. So you can imagine that all those countries were probably calling the White House, being like, WTF, please don't do this with Iran. We don't really want this right now. Um, Iran said that it was open to negotiations, but it sounds like that the demands that the Trump administration wants is it wants zero enrichment of uranium, it wants limits on Tehran's ballistic missile program, and it wants it to end its support for regional proxies. An Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson said that, okay, we can talk about all of this, but time is of the essence as Iran wants the lifting of unjust sanctions sooner. So that tells you something about what they're thinking about in terms of the Iranian economy. It also sounds like Iran is ready to play ball in the enrichment. They're willing to offer even 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium over. It's the ballistic missile program that is really the tripping point and has been the tripping point since the JCPOA. As soon as the JCPOA was agreed to, Iran started testing missiles, and this really is the original sin of the relationship in general. So at least we see some off ramp that is there. The flip side of this is that over the weekend, there was also um, a pretty significant uptick in violence across Balochistan, which is a southwestern province of Pakistan. It's sandwiched between Iran and Afghanistan. Not a great place geopolitically if you want to be sandwiched between two different things. Pakistani security forces say 145 militants were killed in a 40-hour battle. There was a series of coordinated gun and bombing attacks across the province. At least 50 are dead thus far. Pakistan blaming India. The U.S. Criticized the attacks and condemned them. And this fits in because this borders Iran. Like, I don't exactly know how this puzzle piece fits in there, but when you've got this U.S. armada off the Persian Gulf, you've got all of these threats, and then suddenly you've got Balochistan popping off. Feels like too much to be a coincidence. Where do you want to start with this, cousin?
That was a very thorough, rundown. One thing you missed is that there was a news item that they would have live fire exercises, naval exercises in the Persian Gulf. And then Iran came out, I think, on Sunday. So we're recording this on February 2nd, Monday. But 24 hours ago, they basically said, nope, that was a lie. We're not going to have that. That seems like a
Mm.
step down. It seems like there was going to be a live fire exercise right in the Strait of Hormuz where, a ton of oil transits through, and then they decided not to. So where do we start? I mean, our listeners are here to kind of be educated about what's going on in the world. We're not here to solve any problems or offer any juicy trades. So I'm just wondering if we should just step back here and, you know, where is this all going? Iran and the U.S. have been enemies since 1979. We had Kamran Bokhari, our former Stratford colleague, on this pod a couple episodes ago, and I would definitely encourage everyone to listen to that. I think that Iran's current regime is at the end, and it's at the end because it doesn't have a viable economic growth prospects. It its allies are either extremely weak or ambivalent towards its future, and always have been. Russia, in particular, has been quite ambivalent and quite a poor ally. It dangled the advanced surface to air missiles over Iran for decades. This is something that very few people understand. Russia and Iran are not natural allies, they're actually competitors for Central Asia. And so when it came to arming Iran, Russia actually dangled those air defense systems for a decade, like not delivering them. Finally, they delivered them, and apparently they didn't work at all last year in 2025 when Israel and the US attacked them. And then finally, China, which has been an ally of Iran, has also deepened its relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is wealthier, has more oil, and is quite frankly today a greater military power than Iran, which I know a lot of people are not going to agree with because Iran has 90 million people. Saudi Arabia has, 23 to 37, depending on, like, 35, depending on how you count the expats. But the truth is, Saudi Arabia just has far more advanced weapon systems, and they've been learning how to use them in the war in Yemen. So China is sitting there basically trying to keep these countries from descending into war. So who can Iran reliably turn to as an ally? Nobody. It's got no economic growth prospects, it's got no allies. And unlike North Korea, because one could say, well, they can choose the North Korea model, they can just become, a feudal authoritarian state that just wantonly murders its citizens. The problem, as we've seen over the last several months, is that that's difficult to do in a place as highly educated, sophisticated, with people who there's a huge expat community across the world. This is just, you're not going to keep Iranians off the internet and off the news flow and completely compliant. So I think that this is the end, and I think that Donald Trump is definitely concerned about the impact that regime change in Iran would have on oil prices and the retaliation, which we can outline. But I think that he also smells blood in the water. And I think that that's where the risk is right now. I think that the United States of America feels that, well, Trump, maybe himself, maybe the establishment, maybe everybody, maybe the military, but it does seem like this is the moment to exert maximum pressure on Iran. And so I do think this is a little bit different than it has been in the past. And to give Trump credit, I mean, yeah, it does feel like this is the moment to do it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I disagree with some of the details, but I think you and I are both circling towards the same endpoint. The endpoint is Iran is not going to become an isolated pariah state, and it's going to have to engage with the United States. And the United States is going to have to, by the way, put aside its ideological blinders on Iran. And in the same way that Nixon was able to do this with China, um, President Trump is in a unique position on the U.S. political spectrum to do this with Iran, because nobody has been harsher on Iran than President Trump. He's been out there in the same way that nobody was tougher on communism than Nixon. So he had the credentials to go and say, okay, like, let's make up with the Chinese. I want to make up with the Chinese. Nobody can go after my anti-communist credentials. Like, I'm good. Sort of the same thing here for President Trump and Iran. Where I push back against you and where I am not at all convinced, even on Kamran's argument, is I don't think this regime is done in the slightest. And I think the off ramp that we're watching is actually an admission of that. You might remember, when the protests first started almost a month ago now, at the beginning of January, President Trump first tweeted, "You are not alone. Help is coming." Help didn't come. The protesters were crushed. We don't know what the exact numbers are, but thousands, tens of thousands dead at the hands of the Iranian security forces. Those security forces appear to be well ensconced and in charge. Now, maybe after the supreme leader dies, things change, but I've been hearing that mode of analysis for literally 15 years. When the supreme leader, okay, like, he will die eventually, we can cross that bridge when we get to it, but the supreme leader's still alive. He's still calling the shots. He's calling out great Satan and little Satan at Friday prayers. Like, he's still cooking. He's not going to Moscow like some people are reporting. Like, he still seems to be controlling things from that point of view. So I'm not convinced that the regime is on its last legs. But I am convinced that the economic pressure is extreme, and that President Trump is likely open to a deal, and that Iran is open to a deal. I also think this off ramp, though, is an admission from President Trump that he doesn't have the same kind of power and leverage over Iran that he did in Venezuela. In
Of
Venezuela, it's
course,
clear in
yeah.
hindsight, he had Delcy. He knew what he was doing. He was substituting one for the other that was going to be friendly to him. If he could have done that with Iran, I think he would have done it already. I don't think he can. So I think he's saying, you know what? I need to deal with this regime. Let's start my art of the deal negotiating process. I'll deploy the aircraft carrier. I'll make some absurd demands, and let's see what the Iranians do. And the Iranians are coming to the table. They're saying, okay, like, we'll talk to you on some of these things. By the way, please move the flotilla away. Like, we're not cool with the flotilla. That's one of Tehran's apparently requests. Like, okay, we're like open to enrichment. We're open to talking about this, but you need to start moving some of these military assets away from Iran. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens. But I think it's an admission from the United States that, you know what? We can't pull off regime change. We can't even get rid of the supreme leader and trust that we're going to install somebody who's going to let us work with them. But yeah, I think on the broad picture, you and I are in agreement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, look, I think obviously President Trump has not attacked Iran. I mean, this has been going on since December. You're absolutely right that this is a completely different story from Venezuela. But let's be very focused on what is different. Aside from what we're inferring, from the very clean attack in Caracas and the fact that suddenly, the vice president to Maduro is making deals with the US and US oil companies, there is another huge difference. Let's say that the attack on Caracas went terribly wrong. There's now American Delta forces held hostage in Caracas. Maduro is still in Venezuela. There is literally nothing Venezuela can do to either the United States of America or global economy. And so I think the real constraint is not necessarily what you see, which is that the regime is stronger, although I think you're right. It's more that the pain here is obviously the regime can, go to the nuclear option and start deploying various assets to cause oil prices to double or triple.
Yeah.
And here's why I still think though that the regime is at the last legs, because we are at that point where that is all they have. In truth, very, like, Iran was interesting. See, let me back up. North Korea has only one option, and it's the nuclear option. Like, North Korea doesn't really have a way to ratchet up its pressure on the West from 0 to 10. I mean, it can, I guess, launch some ballistic missiles, but North Korea really has 9 and 10. Nine is using conventional artillery strikes against Seoul, which would decimate about a quarter of the city without using nuclear weapons. That's one thing they can do. They can use 1950s technology, just large caliber artillery, and because Seoul is in the north of South Korea, you can actually hit it with, basically artillery. The second, the 10 out of 10, is nuclear weapons because North Korea has them. The problem for North Korea is that if you were ever to do either 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 on a scale of retaliation, it would be turned into a parking lot. Not by nuclear weapons, it would be F-16s out of South Korea just turning the whole country into a parking lot.
Yeah.
So that's why there's this stasis. Now, Iran used to have a 5 out of 10, a 6 out of 10, a 7 out of 10 on its kind of scale of retaliation. You could use Hezbollah, it could use Hamas, it can use various other proxies around the region, Houthis in Yemen, which are still actively there. So maybe they still have like an 8. The problem is that what's left really is, especially because we now found out their own ballistic missiles and cruise missiles are just incapable of hitting anything. Like, I think last year, some poor Bedouin got hit by shrapnel and died. So because of that, they are kind of becoming like North Korea in that sense. Not in the sense that they can repress their people and turn into a authoritarian pariah state. It's just that there's nothing left anymore to show to Israel or America or the rest of the West. Like, hey guys, like, you need to take us seriously. We can do a little bit of here with Hezbollah, a little bit of here, maybe with some ballistic missile tests or strikes. It's come down to this. Like, look, if you come here, we're just going to cause oil prices. And the problem with that, Jacob, is that that's a one and done. Once you do that, now the US has the domestic political agreement and international agreement to turn you into a parking lot. And that's why I think that, like, pulling that card is so difficult for Iran. If they do that, it's game over.
I think I think you're right in terms of, I think they have two other dials, though, that they can turn up. The first, we mentioned a bunch of the proxies, but the one, and it's ironic that we started with a Dick Cheney joke, this was not intentional, but they do control the proxies in Iraq, and they have significant control to turn up the volume there, and Iraq is a major oil producer. So if they still have that lever, you can pull that lever in Iraq, and maybe you can monkey around with plausible deniability in terms of oil
Yeah,
production
that's a good one.
without
Agreed.
having to touch the Persian Gulf. Second is, and I don't know how much of this is IRGC propaganda or Iran trying to front this. It's very hard to get a good sense of what this is about. But you're right in terms of the Israel-Iran war last year. Iran got spanked. It was completely embarrassed. But two things. First of all, you were the one who pointed out that Israel needs to be re-upped by the United States in that fight. One of the reasons it ended when it ended was because the United States basically cut them off and said, we're not giving you any more missiles, okay? Like, do what you're going to do, and let's put this thing to bed. So unless the United States is helping Israel, there's a limit to how long Israel could stay in that fight. And towards the end, you're right that they did fire off some rockets that hit the poor Bedouins, but that's in part because the Iranians were holding back some of their best stuff. And towards the end of the 12 days, you saw them unveil some of their more sophisticated missiles, and you saw them start hitting things with greater specificity, whether it was I think it was an air base that they were able to hit in the Negev. They were starting to show that, hey, we have some intelligence on where some things are important to Israel. We're going to hit those with these missiles. We've got this. And to your point, it was sort of a hold me back fight. Iran did not want to escalate at that point because they were getting spanked, but they were also showing the Israelis, like, look, we can do things that we haven't done quite yet if you don't listen to President Trump and don't hold off a little bit. And I think there is a faction within the IRGC that is embarrassed by 2025 and the war with Israel and feels a need to restore some deterrence and wouldn't mind another round of conflict here, because that it requires then President Trump to write the Israelis a blank check. And as we've seen from your Tucker Carlsons and some of the factions in the MAGA base, like, they're not exactly happy with just, yeah, let's bomb Iran forever and help the Israelis and spend all this money while we're doing so, while oil prices increase. So I think they have some 5-6 on the dial. Maybe it's hard to.
I think the Iraq one is a brilliant point, and that's why also I think that this time is a little bit different, because President Trump has started using Iraq as a lever. He's threatened to intervene, to pull support from Iraq if the Shia militias continue to dominate the government. If Maliki, I can't believe he's still relevant, but there he is.
Is he still cooking?
Wow. He's still cooking. If he were to become the prime minister, so Trump is, and this is important because I think a lot of our listeners are not aware, but there was almost a civil war in Iraq in 2022. We talked about this on the pod before, but for those of you who have joined us late, Iraq is the jewel of the Middle East. It's not Hezbollah and Hamas. Those are terrorist organizations. Iraq is a state. It produces, 4 to 6 million barrels a day, depending on the day. It's a serious place. Yes, it's dysfunctional. Yes, Kurds in the north, Sunnis in the south, Shias in the middle. But for the most part, it is in Iran's sphere of influence. And one of the reasons we've had stability in the Middle East, even though it's kind of funny to say that after everything that's happened last year, the truth is you can still go to Dubai and have a great time. You can still go visit Riyadh. There's parts of the Middle East that have been completely untouched by conflict. And the reason for that is that Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to disagree on Iraq, and Saudi Arabia pulled its support for various, kind of nationalist Shias. Iran now controls this, and so I do think it's very sensitive also that President Trump is now pushing back against that. That worries me a little bit. And you know why? It worries me because when Iran looks around, last year they lost Hamas and Hezbollah. They lost Assad in Syria. Mm-hmm. And now President Trump is poking them at Iraq. At some point, the deal they have with Saudi Arabia, which has been the anchor of stability, and then most analysts in the West just don't take seriously. By the way, if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably never heard that Iran and Saudi Arabia have a detente. That is now at risk, because at some point, if you're Iran, you're just going to be like, hey, Saudis, what's going on here? And they're objectively going to say it's not our fault. We're not the ones doing this, but it doesn't matter. The detente is not useful if its outcomes are not being guaranteed. And so, yes, I do think that there's a lot of dials. It's not exactly North Korea level. But one thing I would say is that if we can very quickly get to a point in this situation where we get from 6 to 10 very quickly. And at that point, it's just the U.S. will use overwhelming military advantage to turn Iran into a parking lot. And that's where I think the regime will die. It will be volatility of 3 months, and then it'll be over. And one thing I want to say, the flotilla itself is kind of neither here nor there. The United States of America doesn't need a flotilla to threaten Iran. Right? I mean, it has the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and it has more than enough air assets in Qatar and the rest of the region, Turkey. Yes, Turkey has said you can't use your bases there, but you can reposition them. You can find places to attack Iran.
Yeah, I agree with you that the risk is there, but I also just want to point out, this was not President Trump poking Iran. The only reason we're talking about this is because a month ago, there were economic protests inside Iran, and those protests got big enough that President Trump fired off probably a not particularly well thought through tweet and created the sort of expectation. One of the reasons I am so heartened is the wrong word, but one of the reasons I'm much less worried now about conflict is because if you read the articles from yesterday and today about negotiations, it's just the same old shit. It's going back to the stuff that the U.S. and Iran have been negotiating about for literally decades. The thing that was different was when President Trump was like, "You will not kill protesters. We will come and help." That's
Mm.
gone. Now it's no enrichment and let's talk about the missile program and stop with the proxies. There's no like and stop killing the protesters because the protesters are already dead. I hate to say that, but like I think that the Iranian regime like felt a need to crack down, not just because it was sensing a domestic threat, but it sensed that if it did not show its teeth and show the United States just how far it was willing to go, that to your point, the United States might have thought, like we could test these guys. We can poke a little bit. Now we're just back to the same things we've been arguing about for a decade. I agree with you. It can still go the wrong direction. You can still get a faction in Iran that misinterprets. Maybe the United States decides that this isn't okay. Maybe oil goes up another $10 a barrel. Then you can get to a scenario that you're talking about, but I'm a little less worried today.
Well, let's put something concrete here for our kind of listeners to grasp where the disagreement is. I feel
Yep.
like where we disagree is that I think you believe that the probability of a major confrontation is lower than I do. I
Yep.
think that would be fair. I think that you see this as another, in a way, like potentially well articulated and executed maximum pressure campaign by President Trump. Whereas I actually think that in this case, there is a risk higher than you do of a major confrontation that takes us to that point where, you very quickly kind of fire out your bullets and then the US has to come in and destroy Iran's military capability to its core. So I would say that we are at a point where it's 35% probability that we go there.
Ooh,
That we go
okay.
to that. Now, and by the way, just to be clear, that 35% does not include the US using military strikes against military targets and Iran retaliating against American personnel in the Middle East. That doesn't count. That
Yeah.
happened with General Soleimani being targeted. That happened with, last year it happened. So I'm talking about a situation, 35% probability, this gets off the rails and the US has to, like, over course of several weeks, systematically destroy Iranian military.
Yeah, that's a good way of making it concrete because I'm at about 10% for that. And the other thing I'm trying to say here is I think that there is a window open, and I'll call it 25% or 30%, where Trump can pull off a Nixon in China type moment. This can be Trump in Tehran if he wants it. I think the opening is there, but he's going to have to deal with he's going to have to deal with the supreme leader. I don't think he's going to be dealing with the Shah's son or the Iranian student protesters or anything like that. It's going to be that kind of deal. But we shall see.
Well, no, and just to
Um,
be clear,
there you go.
because this is so important, like I definitely respect your view, and my constraint-based framework that ignores preferences and ideologies and blah 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 tends to definitely, if it makes an error, it errs on the side of caution. I think, I think my concern here is definitely not ideology. I think you've pointed something really important that we need to emphasize and re-emphasize. President Trump really is unique on Iran. His first pick for national security advisor was General Michael Flynn, who thought Iran was basically Satan,
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
straight up. He was what Iran says about America, he said about Iran,
Yep.
and he was effectively like just destroyed, I think, by the national security apparatus of the United States of America so as not to have nuclear war with Iran. Total conspiracy theory. But his fall was so quick and so swift, and for really petty reasons. Like, he met with the Russian ambassador. Like, let's pump the brakes, guys. Like, it wasn't that. It's not like he was treason. But he was removed very quickly for, I think, his views on Iran, actually. And then John Bolton, who was another hawk, was also basically removed from the Trump administration. Trump has had this very interesting relationship with Iran, where in his first term, he was surrounded by uh, definitely ideological anti-Iran hawks who think that there's just no way to make deal with him. And then last year, he concluded the bombing of Fordo by saying, "God bless the United States of America, God bless Israel, God bless Iran." So I think that you're really onto something here. And I do think that he thinks that he can do the maximum pressure campaign. I just fear that, this time around, with the instability inside of Iran itself, I think there's a greater odds that something goes wrong, and that there's too many people in Iran whose backs are up against the wall, and so they're not as comfortable negotiating with the U.S. as they may have been pre 2025. But again, I do usually tend to, kind of also give out probabilities that are very similar to that. Like the chances of something epic are probably low, but we'll see.
Yeah, which is, I was going to leave this further down in the six pack. Let's move it up right now and treat it shortly, because I think you're right. The Iran hawks are not next to the throne. Who's been next to the throne for the entire month? Little Marco Rubio. And what was the executive order that the White House put out just a couple of days ago? Was it about Iran? No. I will quote from it. Quote, I find that the policies, practices, and actions of the government of Cuba constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat, which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States, to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. A little bit further on, for example, Cuba blatantly hosts dangerous adversaries of the United States, inviting them to base sophisticated military and intelligence capabilities in Cuba that directly threaten the national security of the United States. I think Trump wants a deal with Iran, and I think he wants Cuba. And I think you can tell Rubio is ascendant. It's not Bolton who's playing the Kissinger role. It's
Oh no,
not,
of
to your
course not.
point,
Yeah.
anybody like Flynn. It's somebody who's like, keep your eye on the prize. Venezuela, Greenland, Mexico, cartels, Cuba. Focus, President Trump. Focus. Like, you could do your nuclear deal shenanigans all you want with Iran, and if you can push them out, great. They're terrible, but like, let's keep our eye on the prize. I think that's where President Trump is probably searching for a path forward.
I know you love Cuba, like, and I know you
Yeah,
want that beach house. Like, I hear you.
it's right across the Gulf. I got my Panama hat
I
right
know.
over here. It's
Yeah,
great.
you can
I'm just
practically
kidding.
see Cuba
From my
from the.
backyard. Yeah, see right out here? There's the Mississippi, Cuba. Just get in. Get in.
Listen, I get it, but I do want to say that, I mean, you know, just from a geopolitical context and standpoint, and I don't want to denigrate Cuba as a strategic, piece of real estate. Of course it is. But the United States of America, as I've said before, has been a great power, has been a unipolar power, has been a superpower with Cuba in the hands of its rivals, right? And so, like, not solving Cuba for another 20 years, like, it is what it is. Iran, if he so in other words, let me put it this way. If you end up being right with your very bold forecast, which I love, if you end up being right, what's bigger for President Trump's legacy? Like flipping Cuba or solving Iran? And I think it is Iran by any measure.
I not to be wishy-washy, but I think it all depends on the how. If solving Cuba means that the Cuban Communist Party makes a deal with the United States but stays in power, then it's not that impressive. In the same way that if
Mm,
solving Iran means you make a pragmatic deal with this current regime, like, that's temporary. I mean, all things in geopolitics are ephemeral, but that is
yeah.
particularly ephemeral. That's not going to last that long. Now, if you flip Cuba, if you bring down the Cuban Communist Party, if it becomes state number 52 or 53, that's a huge feather in your cap. If you can have a Nixon in China type moment where, if we're turning, from Iran from adversary to pragmatic economic partner for the next 40 years, and a regime, I mean, it's not going to liberalize, like the Chinese did not liberalize, but the Cultural Revolution stopped. Like, for the most part, China was playing by most of the rules, and in the special economic zones, it was basically as if you were in the way. If you can have that kind of accommodation, then yes, like, that's also a huge one, and then that means huge things for the stability of the region. So
But
it all matters the how, I think, not to be
but
wishy-washy.
but I see your point, because it's also far more likely, even though your forecast is still quite controversial and unexpected, but it's far more likely that they can effectuate the regime change in a place 90 miles from Miami than Iran. So the nuclear deal with this regime it's not that impactful in a long kind of cycle. So I agree with you. Unless, look, unless Iran is prepared to do what with its mullahs and the theocracy that they have, what we have done with our kings. Like, unless they're prepared to do that. And,
I mean,
like, I think we're closer to that than we think.
yeah,
But
I
you're
don't
right.
want to.
We've
I don't want to
we've
become
heard
a
it for a long
caricature.
time.
I don't want to be a caricature of myself, but I mean, there's a double standard here with Iran. They're not the only theocracy in the region. We are quite adept at dealing with theocracies. So if all Iran has to do is, I mean, Toby Keith, may his memory be a blessing, is no longer with us. But if we can get Tim McGraw to do a concert in Tehran, and the supreme leader agrees to start building movie theaters, And now we could say everything's good, like we're good, like we're open for business. Like there is no reason the United States cannot make an accommodation with Iran if it can make an accommodation with Saudi Arabia. Our, I shouldn't say our, the U.S. fixation on Iran goes back to the 50s. It's a Cold War conflict that is now outside of the context of the Cold War. And if it takes somebody like President Trump, who is outside of the national security establishment, to say, guys, what the F are you doing? You're fighting a conflict that is literally 70 years old. You already beat the country that you were going against. It's 2026. Can we deal with these guys the way that we deal with all of these unsavory characters and get their oil and do what we want to do, rather than focusing on the fact that, oh, in 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh was cozying up with the Soviets? It's like, come on, stop it. They don't like
Yeah.
Russia either, to your point. Like, we can work with these people. Where's the
No,
deal? Like,
and listen. You don't even have to change regime. Like, to be clear, like Iran helped the United States of America. By the way, this is something for folks listening to this. Iran helped the U.S. against Al Qaeda. It helped. It helped
yep.
with
And
intelligence
ISIS.
sharing, and with ISIS. Yeah, I mean, Iranian-linked Shia militias in Iraq were effectively calling down airstrikes from American warthogs. So you're absolutely right. One thing you're wrong, though, I did check because I wanted to make sure I check. There are movie theaters in Iran. That was just
You're
that
right.
was
I was,
stereotyping.
I
You
know,
were
I know.
rolling though. I will hold you back. But for our Iranian listeners out there, just wanted to give them.
Well, I will do you one better. I remember vividly, this is back when I was still working for George at GPF. You remember when we had BBC monitoring? I was going through the BBC Monitor one day, and there was this great report on BBC Monitor about a security operation inside Tehran where some college students were screening Game of Thrones
Oh,
outside a
nice.
university in Tehran, and the police came through and broke it up because it was unacceptable. To your point about how this is different from North Korea, I guarantee you they're not screening Game of Thrones in the cafes in Pyongyang. Like it's a little
I
bit,
Yeah,
it's a little
there's.
different.
I mean, of all the movies to like, I mean, that's pretty explicit. All right, so yeah, I like the disagreement on this. I'm a little bit more paranoid than you on this one, and I tend to not be paranoid. So I don't know what that means. I could be totally off.
Yeah, and by the way, we didn't address this, and I don't know how to. I don't know what Balochistan has to do with this, if anything. It's just really weird timing that's
But
popping off.
no,
But I don't
there
have an
was
answer there.
actually no. There was also last year. It was last year. It was right after, I think, right after the Israeli attack on Iran. But there were anti-terrorist, anti-militant operations by Iranian military in their own parts of Iran, where there's various ethnic groups that have, kind of conflict with them. So there was an anti-terror operation in Iran very quickly after the Israeli and the U.S. attacks. So I think you're right to point this out. As we talked about this last time, Iran is only 50% ethnically Persian. And so we talked this with Kamran. There is a lot of potential for, the society to face like civil war like tensions.
Yep. Okay, let's move on to beer number 3. We're going to talk now about Germany pushing for a two-speed Europe. So this report is from January 27th. German finance minister, it was an event last Tuesday in Berlin talking about a Europe of two speeds, to quote it exactly. And according to the letter that Reuters said it saw, Germany is inviting France, Poland, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands to this 4-point agenda. And the agenda includes pushing forward a capital markets union, moving faster on the savings and investment union, creating better financial or financing conditions for European businesses and startups.
Mm.
Point 2 is the international role of the euro as a safe haven currency based on predictability and the rule of law. Shots fired at the dollar. If you're worried about the position of the dollar, the euro should scare you way more than you want. Just saying. Defense spending, so better cooperation for defense is a priority, and then to secure strategic minerals and to increase supply chain resilience around critical minerals and things like that. The initial meeting was just a kickoff, and there's meant to be a follow-up meeting in person on the margins of the next Euro group. Mark Cousin, this may be just another, added meetings to the dustbin of history, but French President Emmanuel Macron has been calling for something like this since the day he was first elected. and has been talking about how we can't, the Europeans cannot be held hostage by Budapest or anybody else. Countries within the bloc who want to do things together and don't want to be held up by unanimity need to unify more. And then those others can stay as satellites around the main bloc, but we have to come together. This time it's Germany pushing it. And if Germany is
Yeah.
pushing it, also in the context of their increases in defense spending, like this is, I've been expecting this. My bias here is I'm going to be like, yes, finally, the forecast is finally coming through. It's a couple years late, but here it is. Where are you at?
Curious they left Belgium out.
Yeah, sorry,
Like,
Belgium.
I mean, it just doesn't make sense geographically, but okay.
And welcome Spain. Welcome to the party.
Yeah, I mean Spain. Yeah. Well, Spain did. Basically, Spain is an open revolt on NATO, which respect the Spanish for just saying we're not going to spend 5% of our GDP on military. Sorry, sue us. But they then
sanction
also
us with
went
your
out-
army.
Yeah. They also then went out and actually called for the creation of an EU army.
Yeah.
So, it was a very kind of an interesting point that Spain is saying, like, no, I don't want to share with Americans, but let's do something as Europeans. I think this is a big deal. And one of the things I love about you, like, you've got that training that we were beaten into us at Stratfor, where you just really kind of look at items that just stand out. It's the record skip in the sound. It's the weird part of a fine leather purse that just the grain isn't just right when you touch it, And so this is a very important point. I mean, especially what you said, many have suggested this. France has constantly talked about this. The fact that Germany has given up, on just keeping Europe as it is and is thinking about two-speed Europe is very important. The reason for this is something that you learn in political science, which is a very simple point. The more veto players there are in an organization, the less likely that organization is going to be effective. And it's just like a family. Let's say you and your wife, you bring the in-laws, your parents, you guys all go somewhere. You're never going to decide where to eat, what movie to watch, what board game to play, because there's just too many veto players. It only really works. This is why when you go, well, one day you will notice when your kids are old, but when I go on vacation without my wife, it runs extremely smooth. And I don't mean anything against her, but even
Shots
just
fired.
even just two adults, there's too many. Yeah. Like when you can just say what you want, it's easier. The less veto players there are in an organization, just the smoother it is. The objectives are going to be reached. You're going to know what the objectives are. The biggest problem...
Leave it to Cousin Marko to sort of insidiously make the argument against democracy here at 42 minutes into the podcast.
That's exactly what, like you are trying to say, because if you're trying to get Portugal's like sense on foreign policy, like that, well, good luck. And the biggest problem with Europe in many ways, and the reason that country like United Kingdom was always extremely in favor of enlarging the EU, was specifically to dilute the coordination of the continental powers. Let me say that again. This is why Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, who's often seen as Eurosceptic, he wasn't Eurosceptic. He was Brussels skeptic, he was Commission skeptic, but he wanted a strong, united, strategic, independent Europe. The reason he was against the United Kingdom joining the EU and why they had to wait for the poor man to die before the UK joined the EEC, the reason for this is that Charles de Gaulle always said, look, the Brits are going to be the Trojan horse for Americans. And then when the UK entered the EU, it wanted more countries to join. It was the strongest push for expanding the EU towards Eastern Europe, partly to dilute the Franco-German coordination, which always, kind of made the Brits a little uncomfortable about, a strong continental power rebuilding the Armada. And so this is why it is a big deal that Germany is doing this, because Germany has in the past aligned itself a little bit more with that expansion. Let's enlarge Europe. And France has been saying like, well, let's put a stop on that and try to digest the countries we just swallowed. It's interesting to me that they invited Poland to this, because Poland in many ways is still perhaps an Anglo-Saxon Trojan horse in Europe. But that certainly has not been, and I think you posted this as well, Jacob, did you not? You posted on X, and look how much I pay attention to my cousin's posts.
Oh, it's nice. It's nice.
Like
It's nice to
I
be
know them by
seen.
heart. You posted basically this poll in Poland where it shows that the majority of Poles now don't see America as a reliable partner.
The vast majority, like over 70%, like scary poll.
And by the way, that is, if you're listening to this pod
Scary poll,
and
get it? But I'll be here. I'll be here for another 75 minutes. Sorry, go
please
ahead.
tip your waitress. No, but like if you're listening to this from the more conservative side, the pro-Trump side, the MAGA side, like let me just pause here and say this is the cost of President Trump's negotiating tactics. And nobody has given his negotiating tactics more, you know, more support than I have. Like clearly the man delivers in a tactical sense. The problem is that even if you get a marginally better deal on Greenland, the the effort in getting that does have long-term costs. Poles are pro-American. They always have been. They're not pro-German. I wonder why. Like, you know, the the Polish people love America. They see it as liberators, and they are not comfortable hitching their wagon to Germany, but they're being forced to do that because they're seeing the reliability of American support, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's basing troops in Europe, or whether it's with things like Greenland and how Denmark is being treated. So I do think that this is interesting that Poland was included. I think it's interesting Sweden, Norway, Denmark are not included. It's almost like Germany has already decided in making this pick of countries. It's almost like they've decided that the Nordics should just have their own closer union. And so I don't think it's so much a two speed Europe as a multi region Europe that then will be able to come together from various different alliances. So, one of the things that our former boss George Friedman used to obsess about is Visegrad Group. I mean, I think it's completely useless and it hasn't had any impact at all whatsoever. Visegrad Group is the Central European countries, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary. Um, they've had no impact at all. But if you push them into their own grouping, you push the Nordics into their own grouping, maybe there's a Mediterranean union as well. The point is, this does seem significant. It's basically EMU5 plus Poland. And that would create a pretty synced geopolitical entity. It's basically the Charlemagne Europe plus Spain.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to dive into there. The first is, I mean, Visegrad Group. I mean, they did become the workforce for the German supply chain. So in the sense, one of the reasons that Germany was able to become an export superpower was because they took advantage of the V4. So I wouldn't say nothing, but yes, I think you're right in general. Also, just because these are the 5 countries that are invited doesn't mean that these are the countries that will agree.
Sure.
These are the ones
Yeah.
that you're hoping to at the outset. But I think you're right to point out that one of the reasons to take this report more seriously than maybe previous reports about this is whoever is trying to put this proposal together thought pretty hard about it, because you need Poland if you're going to do this in terms of Eastern Europe. Poland and Germany have been at odds. Poland hasn't liked that the rule set around the EU has basically been written to help the Germans. That's their point of view, and they've been asking for changes on those rules for literally decades. If Germany is now coming and saying, okay, let's make some new rules and you get an equal seat at the table, like that's something that's going to be really powerful, I think, in Poland. I think you're also right about the Nordics. I think probably if I was Germany, that the Nordics are going to be along for the ride anyway. And to your point, you don't want to dilute it too much. What you really need to do is you need to have an anchor in Eastern Europe. You need an anchor in the Mediterranean. And it'd also be nice to go to Spanish beaches. So, like, let's make sure we can go to Spanish beaches. Also, to be serious, Spain is the country that was most immune to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because while the rest of Europe, and especially Germany, was betting on Russian energy as the source of their energy problems, the Spaniards were importing LNG. They were doing solar. They were doing all sorts of renewables. Like, they were not really touched by that. The French also had nuclear, so they were less touched by that as well.
Well,
And they have,
Spain.
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
no, Spain's economy is on fire. It's the best performing economy in Europe, and also they have the influx of really high quality immigrants from Latin America.
Mm,
So,
exactly.
it's a way for Germany to basically have immigration. All these countries share a labor market, which means that if you, as an immigrant from the United States, if you were to get a work visa in Spain, you can basically just move to Germany tomorrow. And so I think Spain is an interesting. I think Spain is increasingly important for Europe. I mean, like extremely important for Europe, because not only is
Well,
its
yeah.
economy more dynamic, but it also has this incredible influx of very high quality migrants from all of Latin America.
Well, and to your point, it can be as simple. I mean, this is a little bit simplistic, but Germany is not going to be able to metabolize immigrants from the Middle East or from North Africa. But if you see a Spanish speaking immigrant on the street in Germany, you can just, well, you don't know that that person is not from Spain. And so what if they're from Argentina, or so what if they're
Oh,
from
it's
El
irrelevant.
Salvador? Like, it's
No, no.
totally,
Well, I
yeah.
mean, look, Europe is lucky in that way. I think Latin American immigration into United States of America has been a net positive for sure. Like I think there's no
To
real
put it
argument
lightly.
against that. To put it lightly, yeah. But I would say that the immigration of Latin Americans to Europe is even more positive, and part of the reason is that it's really difficult to walk or swim to Europe from Latin America. So you're going to get people coming to Europe who are already kind of self-filtered for education, for productivity, and so on. And so I think that that's something to keep in mind. Like Spain really, really attracts high quality migrants. Plus, on the other side, Poland has attracted high quality migrants from Ukraine. So
Hmm.
one of the things that I think is hilarious is that every time I go on the road and pitch my very positive view on Europe, um, the number one argument against that is demographics. And one thing that I don't think investors and just regular folks out there understand is that for the next 5 to 10 years, I think Europe will absolutely wipe the floor with America when it comes to demographics. With demographics, because the United States of America is basically ending all immigration whatsoever, whereas Europe has these two incredible veins into right this core. One is immigrants from Ukraine, which tend to be high quality, very easily integrated. I mean, their kids are basically German now already. And then on the other side, you have this Latin American immigration, which absolutely is a very positive wave of immigrants. I mean, if you think about Spanish speaking immigrants in Central Core Europe, the Spanish and Portuguese immigrants have been very additive to places like Switzerland or Spain. And we're talking the 1950s and 1960s waves of immigrants, let alone basically the people from Latin America who will be additive as well. So yeah, this is a very it's an interesting idea. I think that a lot of countries on the periphery are obviously not going to like this. But what I think is important is how much nobody in core Europe cares anymore. You know?
Yeah, which is, it'll be really interesting to watch what Hungary does now in particular, because I think Viktor Orban, I mean, as all leaders do, everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses. One of his strengths, at least in the 2010s, was he was ahead on Euroscepticism and he kind of understood where the puck was going. And I think he was able to steer Hungary in a positive direction. If and you know he's been around maybe for too long now. Maybe the strength of that signal is going to be a little bit weaker. But one of the several things I would be watching for going forward is, what does he do? Does he smell that there's a real change afoot? Because if he does, we should see a change in Hungary's
That's a
orientation and in
great
some of the
point.
orientation of these powers.
Also Serbia, like my
Yes.
home country as well. See, when you're one of 30, when you're one of 20, you have a veto. Like that veto has value. You're the thorn. You're the annoying guy that I want Hawaiian pizza. Like, bro, nobody wants Hawaiian pizza. Like, we can only order four. You're gonna take like we're gonna have to be picking off the pineapples. Although, by the way, as a side point, I love Hawaiian pizza.
Oh
But
God,
my point is
no.
like that's Orban. Orban was the guy ordering Hawaiian pizza. Everybody had to accommodate him because everybody had to dance around this politically correct like way of everyone's equal in Europe. And now it's like Germans are like, no, everyone's not equal in Europe. Orban, you can do whatever you want. We don't care. You want to veto our foreign policy? Cool. We'll have a completely different club right here. We're not going to invite you. Similarly, Serbia, which has really I mean, you have to argue like it's played its cards well. It's balanced China, Russia, Europe. The problem is if core Europe just says, "Look, we don't care anymore." It's you're either do what we say or have fun with Russia, which just spent 1 million people on winning West Virginia of Europe. You know, I think it becomes a little bit tougher to do that, and that's why this is very interesting. And you're absolutely correct. Great idea. Let's watch how Orban reacts to this. Um,
Yeah, and I want to rant about demographics for just a moment because anybody who thinks they know something about geopolitics inevitably brings up demographics, and I don't want to
Always,
denigrate you guys
always.
for doing that. But if you're doing that, I know then that you've read The Fourth Turning, and I know that you've read our old colleague Peter Zeihan, and Neil Howe, very smart guy, very nice. Peter Zeihan, very smart guy, very nice. If you just try and use demographics like a crystal ball, you're going to get things wrong. Because what is demographics? Demographics is the sum total of human decisions about immigration and how many babies to have. And to your point, it can tell you very important things about the growth trajectory of an economy or the problems that it's facing right now or what future policy problems might happen in the future. But to your point, demographics can change and it can change fairly rapidly. So if you're just going to extrapolate out from demographics today and say, oh, and that means this is going to happen, you're not doing good analysis. All you're doing is looking at a demographic chart and pretending like that's your crystal ball and that's going to tell you one thing or another. I can't tell you how frustrated I get when people ask about that because, yes, some European demographic situations, if you're only thinking about where the GDP number is, yes, problematic. But there are things like immigration. There are things like the Russia-Ukraine war that makes Poland go from some of the worst demographics in the bloc to some of the best demographics in the bloc over a 2 to 3 year time period. Just a little rant.
And listen. The other thing is, not only do I know what books you've read, I also know that you just basically live on YouTube and let it educate you.
Yeah.
And that's where I want to say, as somebody who has been a immigrant on an immigrant visa in 5 different countries and who's gone through naturalization process of 2 countries and is a citizen of 3. One thing I can tell you about immigration is that whatever you think about the stock of immigrants coming to the country, you're probably wrong about it.
Hmm.
And who can, like, obviously different cultural groups and ethnic groups integrate faster or slower into different countries. So somebody from Argentina is going to integrate into Spain much faster than they will to the United States of America, obviously. But the fact is, some of the narratives out there in Europe are clearly just Islamophobic. I'm sorry, guys. Like, you're just being Islamophobes. Stop watching those YouTube clips. There are many, many Muslim migrants into Europe who have absolutely integrated. Absolutely. And so I think that's the other narrative out there, that European demographics are not just bad because they're not having enough babies, but the quality of immigrants is very poor. And the truth is that, yes, there's some parts of Europe where some Muslim migrants have not integrated and probably maybe never will. But that number is much, much smaller than the YouTube videos you're watching suggest.
And this is one, I mean, this is to bring it back to the national security strategy. I mean, the Trump administration thinks civilizational erasure is happening in Europe. That's how they're approaching Europe, and they're doing it exactly. They're thinking about Europe in the wrong way. Um, this is just an anecdote, but I just had coffee with somebody who's in the shipping industry, and we were talking about the shipping industry, and he talked about how there have been a lot of advances and research around autonomous ships, which sounds pretty
Mm.
cool. Like you don't need people in the ships anymore; they could just go where they need to go. Makes a lot of sense to me. And I asked him, well, are those mostly being built in Asia? Because I know that Japan and South Korea, China are the big shipbuilders. And he said, no, Europe is leading the way here. And there was supposed to be a push to do this in the United States, but the unions around the dock workers and the ship workers didn't really like that so much. So even though they've pushed the Trump administration to try to do this, like they're not able to get any of the
Wait,
things that they need to do this. So it's happening in Europe. And I was like,
wait,
see, like, yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
wait,
you can.
wait. Europe is good at manufacturing? That's a shocker.
Not only manufacturing, but at technology, like autonomous. Like, okay, Tesla, you can have your shitty car that China's gonna like lap you on or whatever. But who's building autonomous ships so that you don't need those immigrants to be on the ships that are traversing the world, bringing your products to and fro? The Europeans, like they're the ones. Remember, they're the original colonizers. They're the OG
Well,
colonizers. You think they're
and
just gonna
that's
walk like into that good night?
no, and that's the problem I also have with this idea of civilization or erasure. European civilization is, it's a syncretic civilization that exhibits a lot of integration throughout its history. And America's 250 years old. So, like, this is like a country that's 250 years old that has a very clear sense of where it came from because it can, like, literally point to Plymouth Rock, telling a civilization that's thousands of years old that they're going to get erased. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Part of that is that, you know, like, for example, Latin American immigrants coming into Europe via Spain and Portugal and then spreading throughout Europe, the reason they're not going to have trouble integrating into Europe is because they are civilizationally European. you know, they are not. And that's where in the United States of America, there might be problems with integrating Latin American immigrants culturally, at least in the MAGA camp. That's one of the things that motivated President Trump's election. And God bless, although, like Hispanics themselves voted for Trump in greatest numbers. So to give Trump due, there were concerns about crime. There were concerns about illegal immigration. It wasn't just cultural, pseudo racism. But the point that I'm getting at is that Europe does actually, ironically, have some advantages in integrating some people from some parts of the world, perhaps better than the US. And I would say Latin America is one of them. And there's like, what, 500 million people in Latin America that Europe can tap into? That's a lot.
Yeah. I think this is a good point to bring up another thing that we're going to put in the six pack, but I think this just glams on here in general. The Secretary General of the United Nations warned that the organization is in danger of imminent financial collapse due to unpaid fees and a budget rule that forces the global body to return unspent money. They didn't call out the United States directly, but the U.S. is supposed to account for roughly 22% of the core budget. China's next because you contribute based on the size of the economy of each member state, and it looks like there's about 1.5 billion in outstanding dues. The U.S. apparently owes 2.19 billion to the regular UN budget, and then another couple billion for some other things. No immediate response from the State Department. I was of two minds at this, cousin. Number one, I mean, obviously the UN is going to decline in relevance, and we probably shouldn't be looking towards the UN or the Board of Peace or anything else like that. I'm focused on two-speed Europe as the sort of thing that really animates me. I'd also just say, though, if you're China, I mean, the UN is for sale. Do you want it? Do you want to fill the gap? Would you like to kick the United States? If you're India, you could very easily buy some of the UN if you wanted to. It wouldn't take that much, and I wonder if there's any value to that. But it goes to this point about multipolarity. The UN was the perfect expression of the liberal international order and how most countries decided to join into that, and it is literally going bankrupt in front of our eyes. Is there a better metaphor for what we've been talking about all year, or all of last year?
Again, I love the way you pick these items. I think you are truly an artist, and this is like a canvas that you just paint, because every topic you pick is so exciting to me, and I can just take it into so many different directions. We had, I think, a whole episode of this podcast on summitry and summits and congresses, and I brought up that the last time the planet was multipolar, summits were the way you resolved issues. They weren't permanent. They were issue-specific congresses and summits. So you would say, hey, this place called Bosnia and Herzegovina, part of the Ottoman Empire, seems to be in disarray. What do we do with it? And then Austria-Hungary says, we want to take it. And the Russians are like, no, it's full of Slavs. We want to take it. And then you have a summit, and you get together, and you kind of say, okay, what do we do with this place? Let's not get into a war. And the truth is that I just think that that's the world we're in. I don't think the Board of Peace makes sense if it's Gaza focused. I actually don't have a problem with it. I don't know why liberals are losing their mind over this. What's wrong with this? Why not have Board of Peace? I mean, should Tony Blair be on it? Okay, maybe not. I don't know. Seems kind of reaching for the past. Maybe, but on the other hand,
because it's not about Gaza, because he's inviting countries like Belarus to join the Board of Peace and send $1 billion along with their membership fee. It's
fine, but look. Let's say it is about Gaza. Let's say, and then you want to have a Board of Peace for Gaza. That makes sense.
Yes, that's just not what it is. That was the genesis of the idea, and now it's become now it's the Trump Club, but we'll call it the Board of Peace, and I'd like $1 billion per membership fees to pay your dues. And the only people joining are Kazakhstan and Belarus and some of these others. With apologies to the countries that have joined. I'm sure.
But do we know where the money's going to? It can't be going
I haven't done the research, but I assume it goes to Trump somehow. I mean, he's literally selling pardons and putting the money in his super PAC. Okay, let's not be anything but clear-eyed about how this administration is approaching the issue of corruption.
Okay, going back to the point, I think that.
And by the way, if anyone thinks that's Trump derangement syndrome, everything I just said is 100% factually true. So if it's Trump derangement syndrome, maybe you have a problem with reality. Cool. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, so Look, the UN. I just think it's a great news item. It's a great news item. I do think you can expand it beyond just financial troubles of the UN. I don't know why China or India would buy it. To your point that they can. I mean, it's like buying, the what's it called? The hotel in Geneva. I think it's called the President or the Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah,
The hotel that
I
was,
spoke there a couple of years ago. It's nice.
yeah, like where the League of Nations was like right next door. It's like it's just buying a hotel. It doesn't mean anything anymore. We are fully today in League of Nations territory for the United Nations. That's where we are. I don't remember the last time that I said, "Ooh, let me see what's happening at the UN." I genuinely don't know the last time. And the funny thing about this is that I got my first girlfriend at a Model United Nations, and then I
Hmm.
found my wife at a Model United Nations as well.
Wow.
Like I'm 2 for 2, and I may have only taken 2 shots in my whole life. I'm not gonna either confirm or deny that fact. The point is, I love the UN. I was a Model United Nations geek. This is what built me. The fact of the matter, though, is that in today's world, it just does not matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is great powers, as Mark Carney said at Davos. What matters is great powers getting together and solving issues, and then middle powers kind of having to band each other together to not be on the menu. But that will require, I think, an issue specific format. So there's a problem in the Congo. There should be a summit on the Congo. There's a problem in Sudan. There should be a summit in Sudan. And I think that unfortunately, I just don't think UN has a role to play at all in that world.
Okay, well, I'm taking from this that I should prepare my daughters to make sure that they're ready for model board of peace meetings because that's where they're going to find a spouse. That'll be good.
Yeah. I mean, it depends how nerdy they are, but let me just make one thing clear. Like, who do you think is an alpha in that crowd? You know what I mean? Like, you've got slim pickings, like if you're a girl there. So I was like top of the food chain in that in that gathering.
Oh, I never forgot it. All right, moving on in our six pack. We should probably invite friend of both of us, Tobias Harris, on the podcast. Not the
Yeah.
basketball player, but the Japan expert to talk about
Although
Japanese elections.
I would love to talk to Tobias Harris about his career as well. Like, let me
Oh
just tell
yeah.
you,
Well, if we could get a
like,
double Tobias Harris episode, that would be really. I mean,
it's
gosh,
fire.
we. And maybe we have cousin Gherkin on for that conversation as well. I admit I had not been following this quite as closely until the last couple of days as the poll number started to come in. If you're in macro land, you've been thinking about this for the last week because the yield on Japanese bonds has been climbing extraordinarily over the past week or two because Prime Minister Takaichi of Japan has called for a snap election. She's also talked about getting rid of austerity. She wants more Japanese investment. She has said some controversial things about whether the yen is weak or strong and what that means for the Japanese population. But the latest polling and Tobias Harris put this on his Substack just yesterday, and I thought it was very interesting, was that new polling suggests that the LDP, Takaichi's party, could win maybe a supermajority in the lower house, and that would allow them to overrule the upper house. And suddenly now we're getting a very different kind of Japanese political situation than we would have even thought 2, 3 months ago, where Takaichi was dealing with not even a majority, and having to deal with China, which was making an example out of Japan with some remarks that she said about Taiwan. By the way, for the Chinese analysts that are listening, yet another example of when China tries to go hard in the paint against someone and it does the opposite of what they hoped. Maybe they thought they were
Yeah,
going to create more instability in Japanese politics. Looks like
great
the
point.
exact opposite thing happened. They rallied around the flag. We don't have the elections yet. But there's a macro story here about Japanese government bonds and about the yen and about Japan's economy going forward. And then there's also the geopolitical story about, is this finally the moment where Japan gets a strong prime minister who wakes Japan up into this multipolar world? I thought maybe it was going to happen after Abe was assassinated and you just didn't have a Japanese leader with enough support to push through some of the things necessary to do that. But if Takaichi comes through with these poll numbers, Japan looks like a power with a lot more agency. And when Japan has agency and a need to change, usually Japan changes the world. So I wanted to at least cook on that a little bit and maybe set the stage for welcoming Tobias on in the coming week or maybe next 2 weeks to talk about this. What do you think, cousin?
Oh man, so many things that I'm actually thinking about this. I think that, on one side, you could say that Takaichi is playing with fire because Japanese debt levels are enormous, but their net debt is actually pretty low. And that is because they have substantive domestic savings. The other
Hmm.
issue is that interest payments are only about 1% of their total collected revenues. So think of like all the taxes a country collects, like your income. Your income is the money you get paid as salary or whatever, endorsement deals because we're such athletes, stuff like that, obviously. But then you have to pay your credit card bill.
Hmm.
And United States of America spends 12% of all the revenues it raises. Depends how you calculate it. Some people get higher. I'm at 12. It's fine. Hold your horses. It's a lot. 12% of all the dollars, all the money America raises from tariffs, from income taxes, from corporate taxes, 12% of it, more than what America spends in defense, goes towards paying American interest. Japan is only at 1%, 1%. And so what's interesting here, Jacob, what's shocking, what's stunning, what's kind of insane is that it is not irresponsible for her to be super irresponsible with fiscal policy. Like if they just go crazy and build 7 bridges over a river that already has one bridge, they shouldn't care. Because no matter how high the 10-year gets in Japan, they're kind of going to be okay. But the irony of this is because it's such a huge market and because so many Japanese investors are out there, it creates this interesting pool where investors might start looking at the JGB yield, which has been suppressed basically artificially by the government. They might say, hey, look, the JGB is at 3%. I expect the yen to appreciate over the next 5 years. I'm okay holding this rather than the US. So what's funny? What's funny about this situation is that what happens in this election and how Takaichi like responds to it from a fiscal perspective, from does she spend money, do these yields go higher, it could cause a bond market ride in America. This is
Mm.
what I think is interesting. It will raise American cost of financing its debt. And that's why this is truly a big deal. Japan being sleepy and obsessed with austerity and trying to be prudent is in a way what's attracted a lot of global investors to American assets. There's nothing else you can really buy. It's a safe haven, it's fine. But suddenly, the JGB is not just a safe haven, which it has been, even with low yields, but it's actually now also yielding something substantive. And then if you factor into that perhaps potential currency appreciation, you're not talking quite an interesting flow of investors away from the US to Japan. Anyways, I'm just spitballing. I don't have a hard conviction view on this. I just think that what happens in Japan obviously matters. The other thing that she is known for, and this is what you point out with China, I mean, she is kind of a hawk, right? Abe was her mentor. And so not only is she potentially revolutionary on the fiscal side, she might also be revolutionary on just giving Japan the rebirth that Abe tried.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things there. I mean, first of all, I'll quote her. We will end this trend of excessive austerity and insufficient investment, end quote. So she's clearly saying that. She has also talked about her commitment to, she's given nods to fiscal responsibility, but she's also talked about deploying fiscal resources to support industrial policy and to provide
Right.
relief from the rising cost of living, including with a full embrace of a consumption tax cut on foodstuffs. So if she gets like a sizable majority as a result of this election. I'm with you. I don't have a high conviction of which direction this goes, but I have a pretty high conviction of which direction she's going to go. Like she, I think, is going to double down on those things. The Shinzo Abe comparison is interesting because Shinzo Abe was her mentor. But one of the interesting things about Abe was he was the one who articulated better than anyone else this return of Japan to pride rather than shame about its past and wanting Japan to be a strong power again. And yet he had a phenomenal relationship with Xi Jinping. He was able
Mm.
to maintain really
Yeah.
good relations with China, and Japanese companies are disproportionately exposed to what's happening in China. It causes a lot of economic pain if those supply chains start to go away. And Japanese companies were at the forefront, by the way, of not nearshoring, but dual shoring. They were going to have China specific supply chains and then everywhere else supply chains. That was the way that they were trying to hedge their risks going into the 2020s and dealing with some of the dynamics that you and I have talked about for a long time. And the thing about Takaichi that was interesting was, I mean, I don't think she meant to cause a problem with China. I think she just said something off the cuff, and it was very clear China was waiting for her to say something so that they could jump all over her. And they wanted to make an issue of it. And so none of Shinzo Abe's magic with Xi Jinping seems to be working with Takaichi. I don't know if that's something has changed in how China approaches Japan. I don't know if that's that Shinzo Abe was saying nice things to Xi Jinping behind the scenes while Takaichi is not doing that. Maybe she's much more of a dyed-in-the-wool believer, whereas Shinzo Abe was less of an ideologue and more of a pragmatist. He was not shy of pushing the ideologue button if it served his interests, but much more of a pragmatist. If you read some of the history about him. So yeah, I mean, it'll be really interesting. And I also don't know how to think about Japan-U.S. relations in this context, because, you know, you mentioned this at the very beginning. If we get some kind of U.S.-China trade deal, what does that mean for Japan? And Japan has kind of been left out both by the Biden administration and the Trump administration
Right.
in terms of the U.S. approach here. So why is there any incentive for Japan to align monetary or fiscal policy in a way that's going to help the U.S. Treasury or help what Scott Bessent wants? Because I don't think Donald Trump is thinking about it. It's an interesting moment.
Well, look, a fiscal policy can be extremely positive for the currency. I mean, it was for the dollar over the course of the last 7 years that the U.S. has been running a pro-cyclical fiscal policy. Part of that is that monetary policy, you know, as long as it's like semi-orthodox and they're not cutting interest rates, but they're offsetting fiscal policy with some hawkishness, you know, that would be very positive, obviously, for like the yen. And I think that American policymakers, for the most part, will be okay with that. But I think that what you're pointing out is a bigger thing. You know, everything you're talking about her in terms of industrial policy, in terms of investment, you could have read the same thing from Friedrich Merz's Davos speech, which very few people listened to. You know, Carney didn't just overshadow Trump; he overshadowed pretty much everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Merz had a great speech as well. And what everyone's outlining out there, Jacob, and I don't want to give too much because this is kind of my main macro view for my clients, but what's happening around the world is that Donald Trump has just catalyzed every single country to stop and say, wait a minute, the gravy train is done. Like the Americans are not, it's not just that they're like unreliable geopolitical ally. That's not what it is at all. It's not about that. Although, yes, you can add that. It's more like, wait a minute, you know, we kind of have to think like Trump. Like the man is right. Make America great again. Make Canada great again. Make Japan great again. That's what Trump has actually permanently gifted to the world. And I don't necessarily think it's always wrong. There are inefficiencies in Canada, in Japan, in Europe. They have just been left thrown aside, you know, because a lot of these countries, for the most part, could just build something and sell it to Americans who were, you know, spending like drunken sailors. And I think what's interesting about that is that the things that she is saying during her campaign, Takaichi, is very similar to what Merz is saying in Germany. It's very similar to what Carney is saying and what Xi Jinping said over the weekend about the renminbi and what Chinese policymakers are saying about their domestic consumption. We need to be more focused on domestic internal demand. And so, you know, when the history is written of the Trump presidency, there's many things that are going to be written. But I think one thing that most of his critics don't think about, and obviously it's not like he necessarily means to do this, although sometimes he actually does say it. I think one of the things that will be written is that he catalyzed a lot of countries to actually put their own house in order.
Yeah, Japan is an interesting one, though, in this context, because if you're Mark Carney and you're Canada, you're sitting on, I mean, you're an agricultural superpower, you're a potential energy superpower, you've got ties to different markets that can help. I mean, you're sitting in a really good position. You can attract immigration whenever you want it. Like you're in a position of great flexibility. If you're Friedrich Merz and you're thinking about Germany, same sort of thing. Like, yes, you made some bad bets on Russia for energy and on China for trade, but you're powerful and rich enough that you can metabolize the loss of those bets and make some new bets. And you can start thinking about two-speed Europe, or we can start rearming again. Let's make the car factories into tank factories again. Like there are things that we can do, and we can attract immigration like we talked about. Japan's not the same. Japan has to import its food. It has to import its energy. The reason that Japan turned on the world and on the Pacific in the first part of the 20th century was because in order to sustain all the changes that happened in the Meiji Restoration, they had to go out and get things. They had to go out and get materials. They had to go out and get food. And that's what brought them into conflict with the United States. So if Japan is going to make Japan great again, the only version of Make Japan Great Again that does not rely on some kind of liberal international order where all these things are guaranteed is Japan has to go out and get them and has to be strong enough to go out and get them and defend themselves from the people who will prevent them from getting them. And I mean, that was tough even in the first half of the 20th century in Japan, like got very, very close to succeeding. If not for a foolhardy attack on Pearl Harbor, maybe it does succeed. Hard to say that. I don't know. I don't want to say never with Japan, but like that's going to be a much more difficult square to circle in 2026 than it was in the early 1900s. But maybe they can do it. I don't want to underestimate them.
Let me take the other side of that.
Please.
I think you and I talked about city-states and potential rise of them. I think you were excited about that thesis.
Yeah, I was. Yeah,
and you are. And I think one of the reasons that both of us are kind of excited about the potential of city-states is that automation and AI, when combined together, can greatly augment and enhance a small population. And you can actually already do that with immigrants. For example, the United Arab Emirates is a very small country, but it definitely punches above its population and demographics because it has a huge expat community. And it's one of the countries that is actually, really throwing itself into the AI revolution, because if it ends up firing its accountants and doctors, it's fine. Most of them are expats. So it's perfectly fine. The reason I say this is because Japan is a leader in robotics already. Increasingly, industrial capability has nothing to do with labor. I mean, in the United States of America, the labor force participating in manufacturing has collapsed, but manufacturing industrial output has increased, right? We've all seen these charts. Japan is obviously at the forefront of that. They're not necessarily at the forefront of AI, but they'll figure it out. They'll adopt American models or whatever. And what I'm getting at is that why not apply the same optimism we have about potential for smaller countries and smaller cities to punch above their weight due to technological innovation? Why not apply that also to Japan? And I think that this is another one of those countries where demographics is overstated. They sell more adult diapers than baby diapers. Like, I get it. I get all that. But it is a very secure, very technologically advanced country that is a nuclear power. Let's just be very clear. Like, Japan could have nuclear weapons in like 3 months. We all know that. They could have intercontinental ballistic missiles tomorrow if they really wanted to. So they are completely and utterly safe. They cannot be invaded. Like, historically so.
Yeah.
And they are extremely, like the demographic issue, I just don't think it really matters. Your food point is very, very cogent, but like, okay, fine, don't invade Pearl Harbor and you'll have all the food you need because the United States of America will supply it to you.
Yeah.
So, right? I mean, like, why, this is where I think, I don't want to be the guy who says this is the decade when Japan finally makes it, because it's the Widowmaker trade.
No, but I actually love your point so much, because I thought where you were going, and I think this is where you're kind of going, is, God, stop thinking about Japan like a 20th century geopolitical analyst.
Yeah.
Tokyo is the number one city state in the world. Like, why not Japan as the city state? Why not, like, okay, Singapore wants to compete in Dubai. Japan has you all beaten already. Like, they can just, let's go. Like, that's fine for us.
I mean, look, I do think that in today's world, attracting immigrants, you don't need immigrants to like build your like aluminum smelting factories. You just need immigrants for the cross-cultural pollination of thoughts and ideas and diversity, not of visible qualities, but invisible ones.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that I think immigration has enriched North America so much is that, people come from different perspectives. And I do think that Japan would benefit from that. And so would South Korea. These sort of insular East Asian economies that tend to have a very low immigrant population, I do think they lose something in not having more immigrants. And again, it's not for the low-skilled immigrants, it's for the high-skilled, but fine. The point is that between AI and automation, yeah, Tokyo is a huge city-state surrounded. It's very safe. And other than your food point, which I think can be easily solved, and by the way, this goes to everyone. I don't think we can analyze Japan as a 20th century power, but it goes also to China. People have very, very negative views of China because of demographics. You even hear stuff like, well, they won't have enough men to field an army. Number one, that will never be the case. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like how many people, how many men with guns do you need in 2026? I'm pretty sure China will be able to field like 2 million dudes with guns for the next 1,000 years. Okay. The math is not that bad on their births. So relax. But the other issue is that, again, with automation, with autonomous drones, with autonomous, naval vessels, with AI, there is just less of a need to have humans. And so, yeah, I think a sophisticated, advanced society like Japan could do really well. And we could be, again, making Blade Runner movies with Los Angeles looking like Tokyo.
Hmm. Did you hear there's going to be a Blade Runner TV series, Blade Runner 2099, Amazon Prime. Looking forward to it.
That's awesome. But I mean, if it doesn't have Harrison Ford and Ryan Gosling, like, come on,
I'm gonna give it a chance, but I hear you. I hear you. We're coming up on time, but we said we were going to talk for a moment about the Fed chair. I'll quote President Trump's remarks last night at the Alfalfa Club. I mean, this is there's supposed to be some comedy here, so I know that he's saying this tongue in cheek. But he apparently at this dinner pointed at Kevin Warsh, his nominee to be the next Fed chairman, and said, "quote If he doesn't lower interest rates, I'm suing his ass off." I'm kidding. Am I? I really don't have a lot to say about the Fed chair, but I'm going to let you cook on this, Marco, because I know you think monetary policy doesn't matter.
Yeah. So, like, a couple of things. First of all, the most important thing that President Trump said was on the plane, and he was asked if he expected Kevin Warsh, what he expected him to do regarding interest rates, and Trump said, "quote He's going to lower them. I mean, if you watch him on television, because I watch interviews and statements, I hope he's going to lower them, but he's going to have to do what he wants to do." And then asked if Warsh had made any commitments to lower interest rates to President Trump, Trump said, "No, because I don't want to do that. I could do that, I guess, if I wanted, but I didn't do it." So first of all, if you're listening to this pod and you're one of the many, 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 many investors who rushed into gold and silver after it had already gone up 60% and you expected it to go to the moon, I think one of the reasons that gold and silver are collapsing is actually, and this is going to be very, very controversial, and in the age of hyperbole, I'm going to be hated, but I think it's because America's not falling apart. So I know we're at the end. I know we're an hour and 30 minutes into this. This deserves its own pod, honestly. But my thesis here is that, first, on Minneapolis and immigration, the American median voter is not happy with President Trump. His support is declining. And so what did he do? He called Governor Walz, literally while you and I were in the middle of a discussion about this. Yeah. And there was, clearly now there is an impetus in Congress for a bipartisan immigration. We might get an comprehensive immigration reform because of this. So that's one. Greenland, President Trump was accosted and constrained by conservative Republicans on the Senate floor, by cabinet members who do not look like Smeagol, by European and NATO allies, and by his own military. Everybody got together and was like, President Trump, like, yo, we don't have to do this. And what did we get? The Greenland thing lasted a fortnight. That was it. 2 weeks. Done. Over. Then, on tariffs, President Trump is starting to see the constraints of American Constitution. We have the Supreme Court ruling coming up, but also the median voter again. Like, it's just not popular. It's highly unlikely, in my view, that we're substantively going to raise the current tariff level, which is 14.4%, if you collect them all together. I think he might go down, as you know my view. And then finally, on the central bank governor, there was this fear that we would have Chocolate Labrador as the head of the, Fed, and we don't. We have Kevin Warsh, who, a lot of investors believe he was at one time a hawk and a monetarist. And look, let's just be very clear. We did not get a Chocolate Labrador at the Fed. No way. This is not some hack. This is not some, loser you've never heard of before who's going to do whatever President Trump wants. But of course, in the interview process, It's not like there's not complementarity of views. Now, that said, I'm not sure that he's necessarily going to lower interest rates as much as people want. Not because of what Kevin Warsh thinks in his head, but just I'm not sure that that's really what like the economy needs. I think economy is fine. If it ends up needing 100 basis points worth of cuts, I'm sure that Kevin Warsh will do 150. Of course. But I do think that when I take everything that's happened this month, and this month there's been a lot of hyperbole on like just back and forth and a lot of different issues, a lot of them are being resolved in a way that proves that checks and balances exist. And our cousin Matt Gherkin, he just wrote a really kind of, again, unpopular view where he elucidated this. I agree with him. And I think that that's why this kind of like super left tail risk, which is, after Russian invasion of Ukraine, central banks started buying gold to diversify from the dollar so they don't get caught. It became prudent to kind of introduce gold into your portfolio. But I do think at some point, it got to a point where like, your buddy who is like a plumber is asking you if you should buy gold. It got a little too much. I've had some serious people tell me they're buying gold because they expect societal collapse, like literally. And then you're like, well, maybe it's not going to collapse. And Kevin Warsh, what do I think about him as a Fed chair? I think it's kind of not interesting. He's obviously got an incredible resume, so fine. But it's not somebody that you can point to and say, there is someone who's going to be okay with the US dollar collapsing 100%.
Yeah, the only boring things I'll throw in here is even if Kevin Warsh was a chocolate Labrador, to steal your phraseology, he wouldn't be able to snap his fingers and do this. Like there is a board.
FOMC.
Like, there's a Thank you. You actually, there's that part of it too. Also, and you got picked on a little bit on social media for saying monetary policy doesn't matter. The way I would sharpen it is just to say that I think we're at the point in the economy where the Fed basically believes that interest rates are a magic tool that will fix everything, and that by raising interest rates or by lowering interest rates, you can, solve the problems that the economy is having. I think we're out of the realm in which moving interest rates up or down are going to solve problems in the economy. Like we have so many other different problems in the economy that if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand and the right foot and the left foot and the other thing are doing, like interest rates are actually not going to be the thing or the be all end all, and probably never were the be all end all. So I just think we're over indexing on interest rates, in part because it's too clean a story. Like you can write the newspaper article or the Reuters article, like, he wants to raise rates, and if he does this many basis points, this is what's going to happen. And that leads to this market. It's like there's a lot of other instability that's happening, and I think we're over focusing on just that.
I actually thought literally the monetary policy doesn't matter. Let me explain.
I know.
No, let me. This is an ontological discussion for like a scotch and a cigar, and we're an hour and a half into it. But the days when you could pick up the Wall Street Journal and read some interesting article about what the FOMC is thinking and then make money off of that, or the days when you could read the minutes of their meetings and then interpret where like interest rates are going, those days are over. And most people in finance don't get that. So for those of you who are listening to this and you're not in finance and investing, I'm glad this is an hour and 30 minutes of our podcast because you can just tune out. This isn't really for you. You probably never cared what, people who said short-term interest rates did or said. The truth is that we're in a world where macro is geomacro. There is no other macro. This is like geopolitics and politics are so infinitely more important in 2026 and beyond that if you call yourself an investor and all you do is read FOMC statements and try to think where interest rates are going based on what the Fed is going to do, like you're a dinosaur. You and the corduroy pants you wear are going to be buried. Like this is not your world anymore. And I think that Fed watching, which is what we in finance call the art of literary interpretation of FOMC minutes, which by the way was always crazy to me that this is that many people do in finance. Fed watching is going to go the way of whaling. Like there's still like equipment rusting in South Atlantic and South Pacific. You can still go to like these islands in the middle of nowhere and find huge infrastructure for stripping a whale carcass of its blubber and its oil. Because this is the only way we had light in large part of the 19th century before we invented the electric bulb. Like tens of thousands of humans were employed in the whaling industry. Whole cities in New England were enriched by whale oil. And then we invented the electricity, and we no longer needed this spearing of sea mammals to bring light. Similarly, we will not need to read FOMC minutes. And I don't care what they say, because you know why? Because they're not price makers anymore. They were when inflation and growth had very low volatility, because geopolitically and politically, the world was very simple. America was a unipolar hegemon. Nobody challenged it. And on the domestic political scene, laissez-faire capitalism dominated. The best practices of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, that said, government, get out of capitalism, get out of the economy. This is the world where you can read an FOMC statement and think you're an investor. We're so far from that world. We're so far from that world. God bless Kevin Warsh. I wish him the best, but I will not be paying attention to what he does.
That thing you said about cabinet ministers who don't look like Smeagol, that might be the funniest thing you've ever said on the podcast, by the way. That one's gonna stay with me for quite some time. Anything else you want to tell the listeners before we get out of here, Marko?
No, just hey, January's over. And whoever managed to have a dry January during the last 4 weeks, well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Oh, you did.
Well.
Well done.
I did well. It was I had a couple moments there, but I did good.
I'm not much of a drinker, so it doesn't really count, but yeah. It was
all right. We'll be back later this week, probably. Okay.
All right. Can't wait.